Singapore has been raising its goods and services tax, GST, in phases, with the tax rate increasing from 7% to 9% by January 2024. The primary reason for this hike is to manage the country's growing fiscal needs, particularly driven by the aging population and the associated increase in healthcare spending. The government aims to ensure that it has sufficient revenue to fund essential public services, such as healthcare, and to maintain infrastructure improvements that are critical for Singapore's long-term economic competitiveness. This sharp adjustment in the GST has sparked discussions among Singaporeans and global observers alike, raising questions about the rationale behind these hikes and their implications for the broader economy and society. Moreover, what's even more surprising is that if we extend this trend further, we see that Singapore's GST rates have been rising over the past decades, but not as rapidly as in the past 2 years. From 1994 to 2002, the rate was 3%, and it stayed at 3% for nearly a decade. It wasn't until January 1, 2003, that the GST rate was raised to 4%, followed by another increase to 5% in 2004, and eventually 7% in 2007. These earlier increments were spaced out, except for the rapid succession of changes from 2003 to 2004. So, why is Singapore raising its GST rates? Before we dive into the reasons, it's crucial to understand what GST is and how it functions in Singapore. Goods and Services Tax, GST, is a form of value-added tax, VAT. This means it is a consumption tax levied on most goods and services sold domestically for consumption. For businesses registered under the GST system, they charge GST on their sales, output tax, and receive credits for the GST they pay on their purchases, input tax. The net amount is then paid to the government. In Singapore, GST is charged on local sales of most goods and services, imported goods, and some imported digital services, recently included as part of digital economy considerations. However, certain goods and services, such as financial services, residential property sales, and the export of goods, are exempt from GST. Over the years, revenues from GST have become one of the major contributors to the government's coffers, supporting a range of public expenditures. Singapore is among the fastest-aging societies in Asia. Here's a graph on Singapore's median age, data collected from our World in Data. Over the past decades, Singapore's median age has rapidly risen. By 2030, the median age is projected to reach over 39.1 years, rising further to 44.9 years by 2040. As the population ages, healthcare demands increase exponentially. Chronic diseases become more prevalent, demand for hospital beds and elder care facilities grows, and the burden on healthcare professionals surges. Singapore's government is responsible for expanding healthcare infrastructure, including building new hospitals and enhancing outpatient and nursing home services. These undertakings cost billions of dollars. Here's a graph on Singapore's current health expenditure per capita, in current US dollars, data from the World Bank. In 2000, it stood at just $792. By 2021, it had risen to $3,969, reflecting the significant financial commitment required to meet the needs of an aging population. Singapore invests heavily in infrastructure, such as building new mass rapid transit (MRT) lines, upgrading existing transport systems, and creating new public housing developments under the Housing and Development Board (HDB). These projects are essential for maintaining Singapore's status as a global economic hub and a livable city. Here's a graph on Singapore's gross fixed capital formation, in current US dollars, data from the World Bank. Gross fixed capital formation, GFCF, reflects investments in infrastructure, housing, machinery, and equipment. From 2014 to 2019, investments remained relatively stable, but after the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, they rose dramatically to over $111 billion in 2023. While these investments represent a mix of public and private sector funding, the government plays a pivotal role in driving and coordinating many of them. Beyond healthcare and infrastructure, social spending has also been on the rise. Programs aimed at supporting lower-income families, providing education subsidies, and enhancing public amenities require substantial funding. As the cost of living increases, these social programs become even more essential to maintaining equity and stability in society. The Singaporean government is focusing on enhancing programs that help lower-income and vulnerable groups. Initiatives like the Workfare Income Supplement and Silver Support Scheme aim to reduce income inequality and provide financial security for older Singaporeans. Just like infrastructure projects and healthcare spending, these programs require continuous funding. To understand these initiatives and the broader fiscal picture, let's examine the Singaporean budget from the Ministry of Finance. Here's a table for the overall fiscal position. The operating revenues of Singapore, which primarily come from taxes, steadily increased from 2017 to 2023. However, expenditures have not always overshadowed revenues. From 2017 to 2019, the primary balance was either at a surplus or a small deficit. But since the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, we've seen the primary deficit balloon massively, reaching over $18.9 billion Singaporean dollars in 2020, with further deficits in subsequent years. A significant factor in managing this deficit is the Net Investment Return Contribution, NIRC, which helps cover some of the shortfall. Despite the large deficit in 2020, the overall fiscal position remains somewhat stable due to these contributions. This trend illustrates the increasing government spending. Here's a graph on total expenditure by sector from 2017 to 2023. Investments in healthcare rose from $10.2 billion in 2017 to over $16.8 billion in 2023. Economic development also saw substantial growth, from $13.8 billion in 2017 to over $20.5 billion in 2023. These are significant sums of money, and overspending on these areas can lead to larger deficits. To address these deficits and rising costs, the government plans to introduce higher taxes, one of which is the Goods and Services Tax, GST. But why specifically the GST? GST is a consumption tax that spreads the tax burden broadly across all residents and visitors. Unlike income tax, which targets higher earners, GST ensures everyone contributes to public revenue based on their consumption. GST is also an effective tool for raising funds quickly and steadily. In a country like Singapore, which attracts a high volume of tourists and expatriates, GST ensures that visitors contribute to the economy as well. Additionally, Singapore has a relatively low GST rate compared to other high-income nations. Here's a graph comparing GST rates between Singapore and advanced economies. While Singapore's rate increased from 7% to 9%, it remains competitively low compared to countries like the United Kingdom and France. Singapore's GST is higher than Hong Kong's, which has no GST, but it is still modest by global standards. Another graph illustrates the value-added tax, VAT, as a percentage of GDP, comparing Singapore to other economies. This shows that Singapore's consumption taxes are among the lowest in advanced economies. Although GST rates increased from 5% in 2004 to 7% in 2007, the overall GST revenues as a percentage of GDP rose minimally due to Singapore's rapid economic expansion. Here's a table showing value-added tax revenue in Singaporean dollars. It reveals a substantial increase in absolute GST revenue. However, when compared to GDP, the percentage contribution appeared diluted because the economy grew significantly during the same period. This underscores why raising GST rates makes sense. It generates revenue without overly burdening the economy. Raising GST aligns Singapore with global standards while ensuring fiscal sustainability. However, it also brings challenges. For instance, an increase in GST directly raises the cost of goods and services for consumers. Let's illustrate this with an example. A household spending $1,000 monthly on taxable goods and services would pay an additional 20 Singapore dollars per month, on top of the 70 Singapore dollars they already pay at 7% due to a 2 percentage point increase. That's an extra 240 Singapore dollars per year. For higher income families, this amount would be larger due to higher discretionary spending. Businesses are also impacted, as higher GST rates could influence operational costs and pricing strategies. However, the Singaporean government has implemented measures to mitigate these effects. The assurance package, initially set at $6.6 billion and later enhanced to over $10 billion, addresses inflation and cost of living concerns. Additionally, the permanent GST voucher scheme provides ongoing support beyond the assurance package. And that's the latest on today's top stories. What are your thoughts? If you'd like to dive deeper into any of these topics or explore related issues, feel free to leave a comment. Thank you for tuning in and spending your time with us. Stay informed, stay curious, and we'll see you next time. Take care.